Good evening. Well, it's evening here where I am. Welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you have been here before. And I am the mature exotical lady, and I'm a new YouTuber that's been uploading videos. And I was just sitting here thinking, I don't even know what I was thinking now. It's sort of gone, but I had an idea and I thought I want to talk about that, and now it's gone. Does that ever happen to you? I was just thinking about how life is just full of twists and turns, really, isn't it? It's just full of twists and turns. So I made a video earlier, and I was talking about relationship trauma and how, in my own opinion, that had impacted my health significantly when I reached my early 50s, because I'm in my 50s now. And so I just really wanted to talk a bit more really about growing up in an unconventional family situation, which is what I was brought up in, really. I was born in the late 1960s to a black father, Windrush generation. In fact, I would say my father was, Windrush generation. Although he didn't come to the United Kingdom in the late 40s, early 50s. I believe he came more towards the, sort of early 60s, my father, But yeah, my father's black Caribbean and my mum is white English, and she really is English. I mean, I've done my DNA genetics, and definitely my white side of my family are actually from England, and some Welsh in there, a small percentage of Welsh, it's said. So I grew up in a very unconventional family. First of all, because it was, I'm obviously black mixed race, and that wasn't very common, in the 1960s, in the late 60s, in the area where I was raised in West London. So I had, not only was there the racial differences between my mum and dad, but also there was a big age gap between my mum and dad as well. My dad was significantly older than my mother, about 26 or 27 years age gap, because my mum was in her early 20s when I was born. I think she was about 21 or 22 when I was born, and my father was almost 50 when I was born. As far as I knew, I was his only biological child, although he could have had other children on his adventures in his life before he even got to West London and sort of stayed there. And I had one sister who passed away now, Kim. She was also biracial, mixed, like myself. Her father was also black, Caribbean, Jamaican, and but she didn't know her father. She was raised with my father as her father, effectively. And in them days, I can only speak for my family, but we didn't know. I mean, you wouldn't have known that my biological father wasn't also my sister's biological father based on the way we were treated, because my father treated us exactly the same, almost, apart from the fact that we were different personality types. So there was that, and also there was the issue that my mum, and this is why I believe there was such a big age gap. My mum had learning difficulties. Now, when I was growing up, it took me a while to figure out that actually my mum had learning difficulties, because most of my life I was led to believe that she had mental illness, that she had some form of schizophrenia, she had a psychotic disorder, mental health. And she was sort of like in a world of her own, literally, my mother, you know. I never knew her any other way. Literally, I'm told that when my mother was pregnant with me, not long after, she spent a period of time in Springfield, which is a mental health unit in Tooting, in a mental health hospital that used to be in Tooting. I don't know if it's still there now. That's in southwest London. And then, you know, and she was discharged. She lived with her mother. My mother lived with her mother. And I remember we lived with my grandmother and my aunt. I had one aunt named Pat, who we lost contact with years ago. But yeah, I remember we lived with my grandmother, who was very unwell. That's all I remember about her. And I spoke about that in an earlier video as well, that she eventually died in her late 50s from a bowel-related illness. And I was about 4 or 5 when that happened, and that did have a significant impact on the way our family lived our life, actually, because obviously my mum couldn't look after children, and really I think while we were with my mother, because essentially during that first 4 years of my life, and it would have been 6 years of my sister's life, because she was like about 18 months older than myself, my aunt was living with us, and essentially, because between my aunt and my grandma, you know, our needs were met. And I remember my dad used to visit. He didn't live with us, but he used to visit every single day, you know, and I used to be so happy to see him. Yeah, I remember that. But I knew my mum wasn't well. You know, I knew there was something wrong with her, but I didn't know what until I was much older. And then I kind of worked out that they probably misdiagnosed my mother. You know, it wasn't that uncommon in them days. They didn't know what sort of, I think she was autistic, you know. I've come to the conclusion, having been in mental health myself as a professional, worked as a social worker and became an approved social worker, and sort of read up a lot for personal reasons, as well as obviously to improve my professional knowledge about autism and the way quite, I would say, moderate functioning autistic women in them days were very commonly misdiagnosed as having some sort of psychotic illness, you know. So anyway, and my dad, he was just different. I loved him to bits, but he was a very aggressive man. I mean, my father, because of the age gap, obviously, because he had me really quite late in life, he literally, my great-grandparents were literally born into slavery, you know, born into the sort of end period when slavery would have just been started to be abolished in the early days after, early years after slavery had been abolished in the Caribbean. Because of his age, you know, he was born in 1918 and he passed away in the year 2000, you know. Was he 1919? He was 1918 or 1919 he was born, but he was 81 when he passed away in 2000, you know. From a stroke. He'd had a stroke and he just never recovered. And my dad was a very fiercely independent man in terms of, you know, looking after himself. You know, he was driving up until he had the stroke, and we all lived in Ladbroke Grove around then, which is an area in West London. I was about in my early 30s then when my dad passed away. 33, yeah, I would have been 33. And basically, my upbringing was just crazy. I mean, my dad was effectively the sole parent, because my mum couldn't look after us. And then after my grandmother died, my aunt got married and moved away, and we never sort of heard from her again. I think we heard from her once, and then she just we never saw, I certainly never saw her again. And then my dad at that point would be coming to the house, but he would actually come in and sleep overnight. He would sleep overnight at this point, whereas that never happened before when my grandmother was alive, you know. And life did change a lot drastically after my grandmother died, you know. There were a lot of hardships, you know. My dad was a troubled man. He was a very inspiring man, a very inspirational man. He was always sort of setting up his own businesses, because he was very knowledgeable. He was a very intelligent man. He loved reading and looking things up, and he loved talking. But the way how my dad would talk, it would always be very sort of, you know, difficult for me to make out and understand what he was actually talking about. He would have these really adult conversations with me, even when I was just young and couldn't really understand, you know. And he would laugh at his own jokes, you know. He was extremely strict, very strict. I couldn't go out. I used to sort of try and work out when my dad would be coming home, so that I could sort of go out, sort of run around as you did when you were younger with your friends or whatever and then come home before he would come back to the house, and hope that he wouldn't know, you know. And there were times when I just didn't make it back in time, and he got home, and I'd come back home, and oh my God. I mean, my dad was aggressive. I mean, we used to get beatings, and I mean beatings, you know. It was no joke, honestly. So yeah, so our family were kind of targeted because there wasn't many families like us in terms of, you know, being a mixed racial family setup. My mum white, my dad black, plus the age gap, plus the fact that my mum wasn't really unwell. So we were kind of like targeted, you know. I remember feeling really sort of like excluded, you know. There weren't any other mixed race children in my immediate community then. You know, there was one or two black families where we were living at that time. Most of the black families were living more sort of centrally in Ladbroke Grove, you know, where my dad had his primary place, where he had a room, you know. He had a room in one of the old Victorian houses that he still kept. And that was, you know, sort of in the heart of Ladbroke Grove, where you had the Caribbean community. So I used to go and visit my dad there. When I got a bit older, you know, I'd walk or ride my bike into Ladbroke Grove, and I'd be so happy because I'd see so many more, you know, Caribbean people, black people. But where we were, which was sort of in a small area where it was mainly white working class people at that time, you know. And we used to get, I remember that people used to throw bricks through our window. Our house was in an old block of flats, and we were on the first floor. I just remember people throwing bricks through the windows, but I never knew why, you know. I mean, I thought it was because and it could have been, I thought it was because my mum, you know, my mum wasn't very well, and so she was sort of targeted by young children, you know, or kids, when she would go out sometimes, because she would look like she was talking to herself, literally, my mother, you know. And I was always trying to defend her, you know. I was constantly sort of trying to defend her and my sister, because my sister had sort of traits of being socially awkward as well when we were much younger. And although she was older than me, it was just the two of us. So I was in a constant state of trying to protect people all my life, really, since I was very young, having to protect myself and sort of trying to protect my mum and my sister from people outside, and also my dad when he was really aggressive. You know, I used to be so scared for my mum because he would really go off on my mother. You know, and he was pretty nasty. And I remember him beating my mum up, and she was only small. My mum was tiny, and my dad was like 6'3". You know, he was a troubled man. You know, he was a troubled man, and but we were all he had. You know, we was all he had, really. Yeah. And none of his family were in the UK. My dad's family were in the Caribbean, and the family members on his side who did leave the Caribbean went to America. He was the only one who came to the UK. So I never met any of his family until I was much older, until I was like an adult, really. It was in my early 20s when I first met members of my dad's family, you know. So that's what I mean by unconventional, because I know all families have got their sort of quirks, you know. But as families go, and I mean no family's perfect, our family was by far not common to see other families like us in, you know, where we grew up, where I grew up as a child at all. And so because of that, we were targeted, you know, and it took me years of sort of sitting down and thinking about all these different experiences that I remembered, you know, and working out that it was probably racism. It was probably a number of factors, you know. It probably was to do with the fact that my mum had mental illness and people didn't sort of understand her, and they weren't very sympathetic to people who, you know, had mental illness or learning difficulties in them days. And also combination of the fact that they probably thought that, you know, my dad as well, this very tall, big black man who looks middle-aged, that is sort of in this relationship with this young woman who obviously isn't very well either. And then, you know, us, you know, in a community of mainly white working class people, and some of them weren't working, I think, but I think most of them were sort of typical white working class West London community of the 1960s, really. It was a mixture of very wealthy people. You had like these sort of you had like these beautiful Victorian houses, and you also had like these mini old Victorian built flats. They would have been built towards I would say they were definitely built towards the end of the Edwardian era, early 1900s at the very least, if not the late 1800s. Eventually they were knocked down, you know, but we had like the old fireplaces in this, you know, you'd open the door and you went straight into the living room and you had the old fireplace, because I remember always sitting around that fireplace trying to keep myself warm, because those houses were cold. Flats in those houses were cold, you know, in the winter. There's no central heating or anything like that. They were old flats, because I remember when we had to move out. I remember when we moved out, it was like maybe around 11 or 12 when they moved us out. And they eventually knocked down those flats and they built new flats, you know. Yeah, I remember that, and I was just thinking how that was the start of my trauma in life, really. And the only other time I saw sort of biracial, mixed race children like myself, at school, there was maybe about 5 of us. There was more young black girls and young black boys than there Caribbean than there was mixed race by far. And there was a few sort of Nigerian. There was a couple of Nigerian, because they were also sort of like in a minority then in my area. There was a couple of Nigerian families, you know, who lived not too far. But mostly it was Caribbean family, people from the Caribbean, you know, who lived further up from where we were. And so some of those children went to the school I went to, which was called Avondale. Yeah, strange, you know, but very, very unconventional family for sure we were. And we stood out, we really stood out to the point where my sister was picked on as well, and that had an impact on her, you know. But my sister was picked on not by little white children, she was picked on by black girls picked on my sister a lot. Yeah, you know. And I remember there was this other mixed race girl as well, and she was like a couple of years older than me, and she used to sort of have these friends who were black girls as well, and they used to sort of go around in a gang sort of thing, you know. I remember they tried to bully me even, you know. They tried to bully me as well, yeah. They used to sort of like come to the park, you know, and if they'd see us in the park, they would just start picking on us for no reason whatsoever, you know. Yeah, and then I remember the experience I had with my white friends then, and didn't really pick up on it until I was older again, was that we were never invited in their house, you know. So, and there was one girl named Jane. Oh, Jane, she was so sweet, and she lived in the same block as me for a while, and she would come and call for me, and we would go out together and we would play. But Jane was sort of like an outcast as well. She was kind of like an outcast. Her family was sort of not the most cleanly of families, if I could put it that way. And so by virtue of her sort of being outcast by other sort of white working class children, you know, she sort of became my friend, and so we were friends. But between me and Jane, even Jane's family, right, wouldn't invite me in. They wouldn't invite me in her house, you know. And I had a few other white friends who I would play with at school and meet up with after school sometimes. I would always go to sort of meet them, and again, their families would never invite me in. I remember when they used to say, oh, I have to go in and have my tea now, and I'd be waiting outside. I'd literally be waiting outside for them to have their tea, you know. And I sort of didn't pick up on the fact that if it was three of us, I was the only black mixed race one, black or mixed race one, and so the sort of two other white friends that was with us would be allowed to go in, and I would just have to stand outside, and I would literally stand outside and wait, you know. And sometimes I'd be so hungry because I would smell the food coming out, you know, of the house, because obviously you could smell the cooking, you know, and I'd be so hungry sometimes, honestly. But yeah, you just sort of, you know, you remember these things, don't you, as you grow up, you know. Yeah, so I was just thinking about that, and I was just thinking about how, you know, anyone coming to this video, if you grew up in a sort of unconventional family, in a community where you were sort of seen as different, tell us about it in the comments, you know, because maybe it's not so uncommon as what I thought it was at the time, even though there weren't many of my type of families in that area. There may have been other ways that a family was unconventional, that I wasn't even aware of and hadn't even thought about, you know. But yeah, certainly it was. Now it's very different in that particular area, you know. Now it's very different, you know. Seeing young mixed biracial people is commonplace, you know. It's actually part of the vibe of West London, you know. It's part of the history, very much like part of the history there now, you know. But yeah, it definitely, you know, I've got so many stories to talk about and so many lessons that it took me years to work out. But one of the things that did come out of that is that I became fiercely independent and fiercely sort of responsible, if I could put it that way, from a very young age. You know, from a very young age, I felt very responsible for other people. You know, my mum, my sister, even my dad. You know, I remember there were times when he would get into arguments with people and I'd be petrified that something would happen. And I would literally try and stop the arguments, you know, that he would have with people. Yeah, you know, I remember learning to cook from a very young age because my mum, she couldn't really cook very well, and so I would cook when my dad, because my dad was a brilliant cook. I mean, most Caribbean men are, you know, most Caribbean men, especially in my dad's age group, you know, they were fantastic cooks. Cooking is part of the culture if you're a Caribbean man, you know. It's not just something that the women do in the Caribbean culture. And he would cook, you know, my dad would come, he would cook. And I mean, that was one massive advantage I had as a black biracial woman, or young girl as I was then, is that of those families that I was aware of, and there weren't many, okay, in my area, or who went to my school, who were also black biracials, okay. It was a mixture of black biracials with, you know, the father being Caribbean, and then there was a couple of black biracials and their father was Nigerian, you know. And I was the only one, me and my sister were the only ones, as far as I could recall, whose father had a daily presence in their life, you know. The other children, young people that I was raised with, who were like me, black biracial, they never had that same sort of black input, if I could put it that way, as what I had, because I really was raised with a very strong black cultural identity. And in fact, because of the racism, after my grandmother passed away, and as I said, my auntie, she eventually married and, you know, left, and that meant my mum took over that particular accommodation, you know. But we never saw any of my mum's family, and they did live around. I know that they lived around because I know that when times when my mum had no money and she would go and she would sort of like, I'd go with her and we'd go to these different people's houses, and I've worked out that these were relatives, you know, of hers. But we never knew them. We never knew them. They never came to visit us. And I think I worked out it was all to do with racism, you know. They were very racist. My mother's family were very racist. My grandmother was okay. I don't remember my grandmother being sort of overtly racist towards my father in any way. And I believe my grandmother on my mother's side, she did love us. She did love me. I remember feeling loved by my grandmother. But the wider family, no. And I think that is why my father sort of was around, you know. And so me and my sister and I, on me specifically, because as I say, my sister had her own problems, and so she would kind of like not really want to go out. She would sort of like not really want to go anywhere really, you know. But me, I would sort of be so eager and keen to go places with my dad, even though it was very boring. Most of the time it was really boring, and I loved it when we were sort of like going into the black community, and he would take me to his friends, and he would get my hair done, because out of me and my sister, her hair she had a really sort of loose curl pattern compared to me, where my curl pattern was more sort of frizzy, you know. My hair it was thick, but I mean it's not as thick now. Obviously I'm much older now, but growing up, and before I started straight perming it and doing all these things, it was very sort of very thick and frizzy textured, my hair. And I mean, my dad used to take me to get my hair plait, you know, and cane road, and then I learned to do it myself over time, so that I could, you know, cane road my own hair. But yeah, I had that strong identity, you know, and my dad would come to the house. He wouldn't always sleep, but he would definitely come every day, because he still had his room that he kept, you know. But he would come every single day when he wasn't arrested. A whole nother story. So many stories with my father, God rest his soul. But yeah, I learned to cook very young, from a very young age. My dad would sort of have me in the kitchen, passing him the ingredients, you know. And the main food that we grew up on was Caribbean food, you know, authentic, real home cooked Caribbean food, because my dad was like literally a generation above the sort of generation that would have ordinarily been my parent, you know, like my mum's generation, say, yeah. So he would cook, you know, and then we would have English food as well, you know, some English food, but mainly it was Caribbean food, and I learned to cook that food very, very young, you know. So that was something that was a real positive for me, in terms of as I got older, and I realised that actually a lot of my confidence in sort of education and what I wanted to do later on in my life did come from having that sort of strong sense of a black identity, even though that had its own challenges later on as I became a teenager, and recognizing that actually I'm biracial black. And although my dad had instilled a very strong black identity in me, because he wanted me to feel, you know, very secured in that identity, the reality is that for some black people, they would perceive me as half black and not black, you know. But that said, my whole cultural way of living was definitely Caribbean, without a doubt, because that was my influence. And if I was around sort of white working class people, I could relate to the extent that any other black person who was growing up in a white sort of community could relate, you know. Obviously you go to school and all that sort of thing, yeah, and it's the main sort of culture around you. But from, you know, the macro culture, if I could put it that way, but from a sort of on a micro level, I very much was just a Caribbean girl, literally, you know. So yeah, that presented challenges when I became sort of a young teenage girl, really, more from making friends and starting to get involved in relationships and that sort of thing, you know. That's where I started to recognize that, okay, so there are people who don't want to accept me as a black Caribbean woman, you know. They want to sort of call me names, you know, call me a mulatto, call me a half-breed, call me half-caste, things like this. But that didn't really shake me. It didn't shake me. And that is what I'm thankful for with my father's input, you know. It never affected my confidence to go forward and do what I needed to do in life to be able to sort of like develop myself as an individual, you know. It affected my relationships, but it didn't affect my identity and my ability to recognize that, okay, this is what I want to do. This is what I have to plan, and this is how I'm going to do it, you know. Despite the fact that I ended up having children really early in life and that wasn't planned, I still had a very strong sense of, I'm a clever person, I'm not a stupid person. I know what I can do, and this is what I'm gonna do, literally, you know, to be able to make a living, earn some good money, and look after myself and my children, you know. So he did a good job like that. My dad did a good job like that. He was heavily into education, very much so. He was heavily into education, and he bought me the whole set. I remember when he bought me, I was about 10 when he bought me sort of like the whole set of leather-bound Encyclopedia Britannicas. You know, there's like 30 leather-bound volume library of encyclopedias that these door-to-door salesmen used to come and persuade you to buy, and he bought a set for me. I've still got them in my house in the UK, still got them. Yeah, I'll never give them away. You know, 1970 something edition they are. And yeah, so that was another significant factor about my unconventional family dynamic as well. Amongst all this sort of difference and poverty, if you could put it that way, because we were far from rich. My mum couldn't work, obviously, she wasn't well, and there were times when my dad wasn't there. I remember there were some days we didn't even have food, you know. My mum would, because she would smoke a lot, my mum would smoke a lot of cigarettes. As part of her condition, she had nerves, she suffered with nerves, and she used to drink and smoke a lot, you know. Yeah. But yeah, education was something that my dad valued highly, and he was a very intelligent man as well, himself. My sister, God bless her, you know, who passed away when she was 45. She sort of suffered with mental illness in the end for most of her adult life. And she had a son. I've got a nephew named, well, I won't say his name, but I've got a nephew who unfortunately also suffers with some mental disorder. And she struggled. She was very clever, you know, she was very clever. She was in university, hoping to study medicine, when when it became apparent that she was going to struggle with life, you know, and she developed mental disorder, and she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia. And then her life just never really got back on track, you know, and she ended up having my nephew because she had been hospitalised for treatment for her mental illness when she was in her early 20s, and she met the father of her son while she was on section, you know, and he was extremely violent, and she suffered a lot at his hands actually. And I believe he's very unwell now. You know, he has been for many years actually. He had a really severe form of schizophrenia eventually that just couldn't really be treated. But my sister eventually passed away. She just really struggled all her life, really, you know. She really struggled, God bless her. She passed away in 2010, which was 5 years after my mother passed away. And my mother passed away 5 years after my father passed away. So my father passed away in the year 2000. And then my mother passed away 5 years later in 2005 from cancer, which was undiagnosed. And that broke my heart. But at the same time, I was glad she didn't suffer, because my mum, because of the way she was, it would have been so hard for her to sort of live a life of being treated for cancer, you know. She just had habits that she couldn't give up. I mean, she was a nervous smoker and a drinker, and a lot of that was to do with how she would self-soothe. That's what I realised, is a lot of what her behaviours and habits were about self-soothing, you know. It was her way of coping with her world, really. So she passed away. She never, you know, she would always talk about my dad in her own way. Because she would come and see me. I stayed living in the same area where I grew up, where my parents lived, until my mum passed away, actually. And then after that, I moved out of the area because I could afford to buy a house outside the area, but I couldn't afford to buy one in that area at this time. Houses were sort of costing £1 million, you know, even back then in West London, Ladbroke Grove. So I couldn't afford that, especially with 3 children at the time. I had my last child by the time my mum passed away. But she was only small, she was only about 2. But basically, then after my mum passed away, 5 years after that, in 2010, my sister passed away, December 2010, from what they called fatty liver. They said that her liver developed so much fat from, you know, sort of consistent alcohol drinking. And she was on really strong medication, my sister. She was on very strong medication to sort of control her mental health. She'd been stable in terms of the mental illness for many years, as in she hadn't sort of regressed, relapsed and gone back into hospital, you know. But they achieved that by giving her very strong sort of what they call depot injections for her schizophrenia. And I just think it was all too much for her as well. I've always said that the real sort of heavy medication that they give you for treating psychotic illnesses, you know, they're going to take a toll on the body. You know, they got massive side effects to those forms of medication. But unfortunately, a lot of mental health patients just wouldn't be able to cope without. It's like the better of 2 evils, really. They wouldn't be able to cope, because my sister wouldn't have had any quality of life without that medication. It would have been impossible. She probably would have done something and ended up killing herself, because, you know, the voices were too much. They were too much for her. You know, I remember seeing her at a time when she'd relapsed and being around her, and it was too much, because she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, you know, so it was bad. So she had been on that medication for many, many years. We're talking about from when she was in her sort of early 20s to when she passed away at 45, you know. And when you're on that heavy medication by depot as well, they do sort of take blood tests every 2 weeks because of the risks. She would have to go and have her blood tested every couple of weeks. But again, the side effects of that medication were what led to her also smoking and drinking a lot, you know, to try to cope with the side effects of the medication. And so the whole sort of situation combined, and my sister died, you know, she died. She was 45, she would have been 45. She was 44, but she would have been, no, she was 40, how old was I? I was 43. She would have been 46, she was 44, she would have been, no, she was 45, sorry, she was 45, and she would have been 46 the following year, so she was 45. My sister was 45, yeah, my only sister. So effectively, by the year 2010, apart from my own children, I had a nephew who by then was suffering mental illness as well and having to be treated in hospital. I was without any of my original family, you know, without any of my original family. And I miss them a lot. I think about my original family that I grew up in, you know. They were crazy family, but I loved them a lot. But it took me a while to appreciate how much I loved my family, because for many years I felt ashamed of my family because we were different, you know. When you're growing up, no one wants to feel excluded. No one wants to feel as if they don't belong, you know. And I remember going, in my early teenage years, I remember going through a period where I just wished that I had normal family, you know. I just wanted to be part of a normal family, what I considered to be normal. I mean, I don't know what normal based on what I saw other people having a family, you know, an extended family, and a mum who they could relate to who wasn't unwell, a father who wasn't so much older and who wasn't aggressive, you know, and a sister who I could have had a relationship with, but I really couldn't in the way that I wanted to, because she did show signs of social awkwardness from a young age, and so, you know, she was limited. But I loved them, I really did, you know. I think about them and it does break my heart. But I like to think they're up there and they're still they're protecting me and that they're proud of me. And that's another reason why I want to look after my health, because I believe that God owes me. He owes my sister and my mum at least the extra years to give them to me, you know. Let me be the one to live beyond 60 and well into my old age, you know. So yes, I'm gonna end this video now. I've been rambling on, but this was really just talk about memories of coming from a really unconventional family as a black mixed race woman in the late 1960s, you know. And I'll talk more about some of my experiences. But for now, wherever you are, have a good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening, or a good night, and I'll catch you in the next one.